say that I appreciate the fact that I'm not following the comedians. I mean, I've gotten a little bit of a challenge in my, I've been struggling with the fact that I talk about taxes all the time. And that's like everybody's favorite topic, and it really makes everybody like find joy in all the things that we just learned about. It's even harder if you follow the comedians. So I was kind of glad that be following lunch. So my only challenge is the biological problem that you all are going to go to sleep. I'm telling you, if I see you getting sleepy, I'm going to ask you to stand up and wiggle around a little bit, kind of going back to our preschool analogy that we learned from Chickenless a little bit ago. That was great. Thank you, by the way, for doing that. It's really great to connect with people and get a little bit of energy back into the process. So I'm going to talk today about Colorado's unique tax code. We have a lot of things about Colorado that are unique, right? We're an incredible place to live. We have one of the fastest growing populations in the country. We have one of the best economies in the country. We have a lot of things that make us a special place, and our tax code is among them. And what I'm going to do for the next hour or so is talk to you about the things that make that sort of our history of how we got to where we are, and what the rules are that are currently governing how we raise and spend money in the state of Colorado for public investments. And I'm going to just get this established right up front. My organization, the Colorado Fiscal Institute, does believe in government. We actually believe that public investments, things that we do collectively, are an important part of the economy, and that it is important to making sure that communities of all kinds have what they need to maintain a quality of life that's appropriate or comfortable for the people who live there. I just want to get that established right up front. So if you think that puts a bias on my presentation, I want you to understand that that's a bias that's built in. But what I'm going to do, I'm my very best to present to you the information that comes from the research that we've done. But I do want you to understand that we actually believe that the government actually provides services that benefit our communities. Okay? So, Colorado uses our Constitution as a place or a house for policy, particularly tax policy, more than most states do. I'm going to be talking almost this entire time about our constitutional tax policy. One of the implications of that is it makes change a little more difficult. Right? When something's in the Constitution, it's harder to change by its very definition, right? So in Colorado, you need a 2/3 vote by the legislature, and then a vote of the people in order to make constitutional change. One of the things that we've seen happen as a result of the constitutionalized tax policy is that we've developed a whole lot of workarounds. Chris mentioned earlier in the presentation something called the hospital provider fee, which I'm not going to spend any time talking about, but I just want to point out that the legislature, we elect people to do our business, and we want things to work well. And as a result, when our legislature comes up against a barrier, they tend to try to figure out ways around it. They've done that, and that's made the tax system in Colorado complicated. By using the Constitution, it implies that tax policy rises to the level of fundamental principles like the First Amendment, et cetera, et cetera. You can decide whether you think that's right or not. I'm not here to convince you one way or another on that. But you have to remember that what that means when you lock it in that way is that it won't adapt and change over time. I also want us to remember another thing that Chris pointed out in his presentation, that revenue moves with the economy. The amount of dollars that are available to pay for teacher salaries and to improve our transportation system, etc., depend more upon what's going on in the economy than it does necessarily more than a constitutionalized tax code allows us to adjust to. And here's the important one. It requires that voters be the informed tax policy decision makers. We did some research a few years ago at the Colorado Fiscal Institute. We worked with activists, people who were already active in the public square, kind of like you guys. People who kind of cared about what was going on. And we spent some real time going deep with a few people, presenting all this stuff about budgets and taxes and a little bit exercise you did today, and one of the conclusions people came up with was, across the board, was this stuff is really important, it's really hard, and I'm glad somebody else is taking care of it. The problem in Colorado is we as voters, us and our neighbors, are the decision makers. There isn't anyone else out there that's doing it. And that creates all kinds of new obligations for us, and I want to thank you all for spending a day trying to figure this out so that you can become a really informed voter. I put this up here not because I'm going to spend any time talking about it, but it demonstrates all the things that we've been doing, major decisions that have changed tax policy in the state of Colorado since 1982. We've done a lot of them. We've done a lot of them. I'm not going to talk about this slide because we spent time with it this morning. There's another one. Chris and I happen to work for the same organization, so our slides look eerily similar, which is actually good. Sometimes they look not so similar, and that's when we have a problem. So I'm going to talk about this constitutional policy. I'm going to start with the Gallagher Amendment for a minute. So let's go back to 1980. Gallagher was adopted in 1982. The funding mix for Colorado, for funding our schools, remember how Chris talked about, I got something on the back of my leg that's driving me crazy. He talked about how schools are funded jointly by the state and local government. Well, in the 1980s, the state paid about 46% of the total education bill, with the local share, local property taxes paid about 54% of it. This is a little slide that it's really, these other two things are really hard to see, and so I'm just not going to talk about them. We were about $550 above the national average in per pupil funding. We pay taxes on about 21% of the value of our homes. Chariots of Fire was the movie of the year that year. And the song of the year was Call Me by Blondie. How many of you can sing that song, right? Okay. It was a year or two ago. So what the Gallagher Amendment is it creates a uniform method of property assessment. So in other words, now when our property is assessed and valued for the purposes of taxes, it's everywhere you live, no matter where it is, it's based upon the market value, what it could be sold for, or what similar property in your area is selling for. It also establishes the percentage of total property taxes that can come from homes versus everything else in the state. Okay? You may have heard of this 45-55 split at some point. What it says is that statewide, the amount of taxes, if we're going to get technical, this isn't exactly how you explain it, but it's really what it does. 45% of property taxes come from homes, and 55% come from non-homes. For the purposes of non-homes, let's call it commercial, although that includes agricultural and vacant property as well. Gallagher says in the Constitution that non-home part of it is going to be assessed at 29%. And like I've said a couple of times now, back in 1982, when Gallagher was adopted, there was a statute that set the value of your home that would be taxed at 21%. Now, why did this thing happen? Well, one of the reasons this all got in the Constitution to begin with is because there was some real problems with the way property was being valued. Emily and I might be living right next door to one another in Northeast Park Hill. And Emily bought her house in 1963 and spent $16,000 on it. Right? I bought my house right next to her in 1980 and spent $54,000 on my house. There were places in the state of Colorado where that situation was happening, and Emily was paying property taxes on the value of her house when she bought it, and I was paying property taxes on the value of what I paid for my house. I guess how that made me feel. Pissed off, right? And so the adjustment came over time to say, let's make sure that as we're assessing property taxes, we're assessing it at equivalent value. But that pissed Emily off, right? Because all of a sudden, she was going to go from paying property taxes on 21% of $16,000 to 21% of $54,000 that I paid for my house. The legislature realized as they made these changes, to make it fairer, there was going to be a lot of property owners who didn't like it very much. Particularly as we looked forward to seeing that, predicting and projecting that home value was going to make up a higher and higher percentage of overall value of property in the state of Colorado. That's why they went to this 45-55 split. They said to Emily, "Don't worry, Emily, the value of your house is going to go up, and your property taxes are going to go up some, but we're never going to collect more than 45% of total property taxes from houses." Gallagher, the amendment, this 45-55 thing, is a residential property tax relief measure. It kept our property taxes low on houses. That's what it was designed to do, and quite frankly, that's what's happened. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of step back. I never know the order on how to explain this, but I'm going to take a little side note. We're going down a rabbit hole for a minute. Everybody know how property taxes are calculated? Right? Okay, if you do, we're just going to do a quick review and I'll do it quickly. If you don't, I think it's important for you to recognize. So we take a house that's worth, the way property taxes work is you have the actual property tax you pay is the property value, which Gallagher now says is based upon market value, calculated based on comparables, right, that have sold in your neighborhood, times an assessment rate. The assessment rate is nothing other than the percentage of your house that's subject to taxes. I don't know why we do it this way. I often say when I make these presentations that whoever designed property taxes was ornery. Because if it's a sales tax, you say, well, it's either subject to tax or it's not. And, I bought this sweater, and this sweater was $24, and I paid, 2.9% of state sales tax on the value of my sweater. Well, that's not the way property taxes work. If your house is worth $350,000, you don't pay property taxes on $350,000. You pay it on a portion, and the percentage of it is called the assessment rate. All right? Does everybody know that? Is there anybody that's news to? All right, there's the news. Thank you for your hand. I appreciate your honesty. There's someone else in the room too, but they just aren't raising their hand. So we take the value of our property times the assessment rate times a mill levy, another one of those mischief things. The mill levy is just the tax rate, right? If it's a sales tax, it's 2.9% at the state level. If it's the income tax, it's 4.63% at the state level. But we don't, for whatever reason, for property taxes, we call them mills. Right? I don't know why that is. But you take a $350,000 piece of property, you multiply it times the assessment rate, which gives you the value, the amount that's actually taxed. You then multiply it times the rate or the mill to get your property tax bill. Y'all with me? Yes.
45,000 times 80 is a lot of money. Is it like 0.8?
Yeah, a mill is actually a thousandth of a dollar. Okay, that's what mill stands for. All right, I'm not going to use this slide, Chris. I know you love this slide, but I can't ever talk about it. So anyway, the market value today of property. Remember how I said in 1982 that we put in the Constitution that we would never raise more than 45% of our property taxes from houses. Well, that made sense back in 1982 because 45% of the total value of property was houses. Today, however, houses make up about 77% of the value of all property in the state of Colorado. So if we were to just say how much is it, all that property out there that's privately owned, how much is it worth? 77% of it is in housing.
And because the Constitution requires that non-residential property get taxed at 29%, the only way we can keep that 45-55 formula in place is to reduce the percentage of the value of your house that gets taxed. And that's what Gallagher has done over time. In 1982, we taxed 21% of the value of our homes. Today, we tax 7.2, and next year, it's going to be 7.15% of the value of our home is taxed. Okay? Y'all with me? That's the way it works. Now, between 1982 and 1992, as the value of homes relative to the value of non-homes was going up, and the assessment rate was coming down, the percentage of our homes that we tax was going down, our local elected officials, whether that's our city council folks, or our county commissioners, or our, well, not our legislators, but, or the folks on the school board, or the folks of the water district, they could raise the mill levy. Right? Because think about this for a minute. This is going to require you to do a little more math. That's what Chris and I do. We run around asking people to do math. But if all of a sudden you're in a school district that's been taxing 21% of the value of your home, and because of this formula, do nothing to do with what's going on in your district, but what's happening statewide, the percentage of homes that gets taxed drops from 21 to 18%. If you have exactly the same tax rate, there's a chance that you are not generating as much money to run your schools as you did the year before. And between 1982 and 1992, elected officials had the authority to adjust that mill levy a little bit to make sure that they were generating the amount of money that they needed to run the schools. And maybe it was just the amount of money that they generated last year. But they had that flexibility to adjust the third part of the formula, the mill levy. But then 1992 rolls around. Again, these are, I don't know. Chris, you got to take these slides out of here. Those charts are so small, nobody can read them. All right? Remind me to do that when we get back. Thanks. So we're back in 1992. We've now dropped funding per pupil in Colorado has dropped from being above the national average to about $620 below the national average. Why is that? When you control the amount of property taxes that you collect, which is the primary source of funding schools, and you limit the amount you collect, you don't have as much money. This is rocket science, folks. And so per pupil, we dropped about $1,000 against the national average between 1992 and 82 and 92. The residential assessment rate, or the percentage of our homes that were taxed, fell from 21% to just over 14%. Oh yeah, the Broncos were 8-8 under Dan Reeves. Boys to Men was the song of the year. So here's a little bit more context. The other thing that happened in 1992 that some of you may remember is that Colorado was a state that voted very heavily for Ross Perot in that presidential election. We had one of the highest turnouts of voters in support of Ross Perot of any state in the country. Also on the ballot in 1992 was Amendment 2 that gave local governments the authority to discriminate based upon sexual preference. It was ultimately overturned by the United States Supreme Court, but that also was on the ballot in 1992. You know what else was on the ballot in 1992? A 1-cent sales tax increase for schools. We were also just coming out of a national recession in 1992, and Colorado was just beginning to kind of get its feet under it from the collapse of the oil shale market. How many of you lived here in 1992? Okay, y'all remember this? So Tabor was on the ballot, had been on the ballot in 88 and then 90 and then was then on the ballot in 1992. My understanding is that the political contributions for that campaign had shifted. A lot of money that had gone to fight Tabor in the past had moved in support of the tax increase for schools because of that number I just showed you. Remember, we'd fallen below the national average in funding per pupil. That's kind of what's going on. Just talked about that. I'm going to talk about 4 major provisions of Tabor. Please understand it does a lot more than this. But I wanted to give you some, I wanted to give us some way to think about it and ways to organize ourselves. So the first provision is that it constrains the legislature's choices on tax policy. Now, in my introduction, Bob was talking about how I wrote this report back in 2003 called 10 Years of Tabor. And I used very different language to describe this provision at that point in time. Because I was, just like most people, wasn't thinking through this very carefully, and I would say that it gave voters the right to increase taxes. But really what Tabor does is not give voters the right to increase taxes or decrease taxes. It takes away the authority of elected officials to do that. We've always, well, since 1911, had the authority to make tax policy at the ballot. That's guaranteed to us by the initiative process. And you remember how I just said on the ballot in 1992 was a tax increase proposal. That was pre-Tabor. We didn't have to have Tabor to give us the ability to go to the ballot and raise or lower taxes. That comes from another provision in the Constitution. What Tabor says is the only way taxes can be raised in the state of Colorado is through voter approval. And it's not just taxes. It's any new tax rate increase, mill levy above that of the prior year. And this is one of my favorite sentences or phrases, valuation for assessment ratio increase for a property class. What? We can't change the assessment rate can't increase the assessment rate without voter approval. Extension of an expiring tax requires voter approval, and so does a tax policy change directly causing a net revenue gain to any district. What? Anytime the legislature tries to raise taxes or do any other thing like, for example, closing a corporate loophole. Let's just imagine for a moment that the Colorado tax code had a provision in it that benefited most the top 1% earners. Right? That if some organization did some analysis of who got the benefit from a tax credit, and that organization showed, and maybe that could even be currently today the state auditor, showed that most of the benefit of that tax credit is going to the people who are making more than $500,000 a year, or about the top 4%. The legislature can't close that, can't change that tax policy without a vote of the people, according to Tabor. So it's not just a new tax or a tax rate increase. There's a lot of ways in which we've taken away the authority of our elected officials to make tax policy. Now I know there's probably 8 or 10 of you in the room thinking, right on, right? You can think whatever you want to, I don't care. But let's just be clear about what it does. Didn't give us new rights. It took away the ability of our elected officials from doing the work, that portion of the job that they have in every other state in the country. Okay, second thing it did. It says no one can, even voters, can use certain tax policy options. Do you know what that's like when you have something dragging on the back of your leg? It's driving me crazy. It's like a hair or something. Anyway, so if I keep doing this, that's why. What it says is that we can't have a transfer tax on real estate. So if you're in a lot of resort communities where property turns over relatively quickly, some of them historically had used a little transfer tax that would apply when you sold a piece of property, they could keep it, but no new municipalities, even if the voters voted yes to do that, can use that tool until we change the Constitution. There can be no state property tax, according to the Constitution. And then also it requires that all taxable net income be taxed at one rate. Well, that's another one of those, I'm not sure, it took me a while to figure out what that meant. Maybe I'm slower than the average. Maybe you guys already figured that out. But remember the example that Chris gave us at the very beginning of the marginal tax brackets? Tax the first $25 at $10 at this rate and the next $10. That's called a graduated income tax or a progressive income tax. We can't have one of those in Colorado because the Constitution says we can't. Okay? Tabor also sets a bunch of election provisions. It requires certain language to be included in the ballot title for any tax increase that shows up on the ballot. And what that title must begin with is let's assume it's a state tax increase. Shall state taxes be increased $1.6 billion annually? Right, and I took that from the last tax increase one of the tax increases we considered in fiscal year 2018, which was Amendment 73. And so it said, shall taxes be increased $1.6 billion. Okay? Now, this is designed to make sure that people understand how much money is going to be generated from this proposal. The question is that the information that voters need in order to decide whether it's a good idea or not? I'll leave that to you. I'm just telling you that's what the Constitution says. All of them must start with that language capitalized in that way. The other thing that some people don't know about Tabor is that we didn't have general elections in odd-numbered years until Tabor came along. We're going to have a statewide ballot, or we're going to statewide election in 19. Prior to 1992, there was no authorization for a general election in an odd year. But Tabor said, if voters are going to get all this additional power, right, we're going to say the only way we can do these things is through voter approval. We have to let voters have more opportunities, because otherwise we're really going to disadvantage communities. So you can thank Tabor for your 2019 election and all the things that come with that. Because prior to 1992, the only statewide general elections occurred in even-numbered years. Finally, Tabor caps the amount of revenue that districts or governments can keep and use. There's a different formula for school districts. There's a different formula for, it's actually local districts, which include school districts, cities, counties, fire districts, water districts, cemetery districts, human services districts, etc. There's a limit for that group, and then there's a limit at the state level. It's articulated in the Constitution. For the state, revenue can't grow faster than the rate of the consumer price index change plus population growth. The counties and locals we can talk about more if you're interested. It has to do with local growth, which is change in the value of real property, but not the market value. It's just you take the amount that you had last year, you subtract from it anything you tore down, and you add any houses or pieces of property that you built new in the last 12 months. Okay? The measure says if revenue to a district increases faster than the limit, and I'm going to talk about the state because it's just easier, but I'll get to your questions if you want to ask about local governments. So in any year in which the revenue that the state collects grows faster than the consumer price index plus population, any money above that has to be rebated back to us as taxpayers. Now, I intentionally use the word rebate. I do that for a reason. It actually says refund in the Constitution. But when you start talking about people's tax refunds, it gets all confused with how much you overpay or over-withhold from your paycheck. Right? We've all done that. You do that, whatever is that, W-4? Where you determine how many exemptions you have? It's the 2, thank you. I knew there'd be somebody in here that could help me with that. And you put in a number, and then that determines how much gets withheld from your paycheck every pay period. And then you true up at the end of the year, and you have some deductions, and you have some exemptions, and you do this, and you do that. And then sometimes you've overpaid. You've over-withheld. And that's what we call a tax refund. Okay? The rebates that come because we've overpaid, because the state has collected more money, are completely separate from that. It is a different amount, and that's why I call them rebates, to distinguish between the two. So when the state collects money that exceeds that cap, the Constitution requires that that money gets refunded back to us as taxpayers. How does that happen? The legislature has the authority to determine any reasonable method for refunds that they want, including temporary tax credits or temporary rate reductions. Okay? So if we got $100 last year, inflation plus population together was a 4% increase, that means this year we could collect $104. Let's say for the sake of this discussion, we collected $106 at the state level. $2 would have to be returned to all of us, and the legislature has the authority to determine how that happens. Y'all with me? I got a lot of yawners, man. Do we need to stand up and wiggle? Okay? Y'all all right? I'm doing my best to make this shit interesting. I just read a study the other day, much to the horror of everybody who works in my office, that people who swear are more creative. Any other cussers in the room? Oh yeah. Well, I got pretty far into this before I got started throwing them out there, but I might swear occasionally just to keep you paying attention. And there were 21 different refund mechanisms that the legislature had approved. And if you hang on with me, I'm going to show you the 3 that are still in place. They changed them all up. But yes, because in 1997 through 2001, the state of Colorado gave back about $3.6 billion in tax refunds to each and every one of us. Right? Doesn't cost a ton of money. That's one of the question over here was, how did that cost? Now I'm going to tell a little story. I'm starting to get in the middle of it. I'm needing you guys to stay with me, so I'm going to start storytelling. All right, just watch out. It's going to get deep here. But I had the privilege of working for the Governor Romer. How many remember Governor Roy Romer? So I had the pleasure of working for Governor Romer, and I remember when his budget director, a guy named George Delaney, came in and told a group of us that we had exceeded the Tabor limit for the first time. And I'm going to tell a little story about that too. The reason, George's been telling us since we're not going to go over, we're not going to have to give money back. We never had, not from 1992 through 1997, but we did in 1997. We exceeded the cap because a rich person died and their family was fighting about how the proceeds would be divided. And they kept fighting through the point at which they had to pay their estate tax. And so it was like a $68 million tax bill, right? And it put us over the cap and put us in a Tabor rebate situation for the first time ever, right? And somebody in Governor Romer's office, who I will not name by name, said, "This is great, Governor. You can write a tax refund check to every Coloradan, and your name can be right at the bottom of it. Roy Romer, Governor." And I don't know how many of you know Roy very well, but he lowered his glasses. He looked at us and he said, "You have got to be kidding." He said, "What is the cheapest least expensive, most efficient way to do this, because I don't want to do it to begin with, and I'll be damned if we're going to spend any more money than we absolutely have to. And so the way those first rebates came back, and one of the ways they still come back, is through an income tax, or through a sales tax rebate, which you take and claim on your income tax form. So you complete all your income taxes, and you put in your total income, and you take your deductions and your credits and all that stuff, and you get down at the bottom, and let's say you owe $100 in state taxes. And let's say, for the purposes of this discussion, you qualify for a $50 Tabor rebate. You would subtract that $50 from what you owe, and you write a check to the state of Colorado for $50 rather than the $100 that you owe in your income taxes. It's considered a sales tax rebate. Anybody know why? If it was an income tax rebate, you'd pay federal income taxes on it. And Roy Romer said, "No, well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Don't do that." So it's a sales tax rebate, and you don't owe income taxes. It doesn't count toward income for the next year. Okay, here's the answer to your question. Legislators currently on the books are 3 ways to returning tax credits. The first is one that is near and dear to all of you, the senior homestead exemption. In a year in which we have Tabor rebates, revenue exceeds inflation plus population, it's the money above the cap that goes to pay for the senior homestead property tax exemption. Please be clear that in a year where the state revenue does not exceed the cap, you'll still get a senior homestead property tax exemption. It just gets paid for below the line out of general funds that we've collected below inflation plus population. So that's the first refund mechanism. The second is the 6-tier sales tax refund mechanism that I talked about. Incomes, all Coloradans are divided into 6 income tiers. You get a rebate based upon what share of the total refund comes to your tier, okay? It serves kind of as a cleanup batter, right? That one always distributes whatever doesn't get distributed through the other refund mechanisms. And the third refund mechanism is one that we've triggered for this year. And that is a rate reduction in the income tax rate. If the rebate exceeds about $260 million a year, then for the next tax year, the income tax rate falls from 4.63% to 4.5%, which is the rate you will be paying for state income taxes for tax year 20. All right? Because we have we exceeded the revenue cap by $574 million in fiscal in 19. And so we're going to have a rate reduction from 4.63% to 4.5%. This is a cute little graphic that shows just what I just talked about. And what I mean about cleanup is if we fund the senior homestead, we fund the rate reduction, and there's still money left over, that's the money that goes back to us as taxpayers through this sales tax refund. Now that's all perfectly clear, right? You guys got it? You're gonna go home tonight and talk to your neighbor about it, right? I've been told it takes 7 times to hear something before you really understand it. So if you're not quite there, don't beat yourself up too badly. Just come to 6 or 7 more of these presentations and you'll figure it out. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about that formula. The formula of consumer price index plus population increase. It definitely limits the amount of money available to government. Because in most expansionary periods, when the economy is growing, revenue will grow faster than inflation plus population. The question we need to ask ourselves is whether it is the right measure of growth in government. And we're going to have a bunch of different opinions about that. But the thing I want you all to understand is the Consumer Price Index does not measure the cost of providing government goods. It measures the cost of providing consumer goods. Okay? Not okay? Don't understand. All right, let me show you a little basket. So, what CPI, Consumer Price Index, literally is a measurement of a market basket of consumer goods. So, what do we buy as consumers? We buy TVs, we buy healthcare, we buy cars, that sort of thing, right? But what government buys is a very different mix. It buys asphalt, it buys education, it buys costs associated with people primarily, because about 89% of all government expenditures go to pay for people, right? They're government employees who do the work of government. And quite frankly, those things are going up much, much faster than Consumer Price Index, right? Think about this for 1 minute. How much did you pay for the first television you ever bought? Right? Your first television set. Got it? Everybody got it? It was kind of a big damn deal in your life, I know it was. It was for me. What was the price of the last television set you bought? More or less. That's one of those challenges with the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index, and all economists will agree that CPI plus population is a much less generous measure than other measurements of growth in the economy, like growth in personal income or growth in gross domestic state product. You can think that's a good thing, right? But let's just understand that it is truly a lower limit. I've heard it expressed, and in fact, a legislator from Colorado, a Republican legislator from Colorado once said that the CPI plus population formula is designed to shrink government over time, not to limit its growth. Again, you may think that's a good idea, but that's what it was designed to do, and quite frankly, that's what it's done over time. Here are some comparisons of how the cost of what government buys compared to what, compared to population, to inflation. And population, when you use just an across-the-board population rate, you have the same challenge because kids and us more mature individuals are more expensive for our governments than, what did Elizabeth call them this morning? The productive wage earners, or whatever it was, that folks in the 40-year-old range? Okay, Tabor, in 14 minutes. Let's talk about Amendment 23, another policy that we adopted as part of our Constitution. It was back in 2000. We've gone from local government, or from the state government, paying for 46% of the cost of schools to state government paying 57% of the cost of schools, and local governments paying less. Because one of the things that happened when the Tabor Amendment was adopted is that elected officials could no longer raise the mill levy without voter approval. Politicians hate to raise taxes, don't send it to the ballot very often, right? Don't do it except for when they absolutely have to. We kept raising lower and fewer local property tax dollars, and we were getting farther and farther behind in our per pupil funding compared to the national average. There's the slide that demonstrates that. Our assessment rate, the percentage of our homes that were subject to taxation, had now fallen from 21% in 1982 to 14% in 1992 to 9.7% in 2000. Broncos were 11-5 under Mike Shanahan. The Gladiator was the movie of the year. We'd had back-to-back recessions, resulted in reduction in state revenue in during the 2000s. And despite a growing economy in the 90s, we'd seen per pupil funding in Colorado fall relative to the national average. Amendment 23 was adopted in 2000, and it took a portion of the income taxes that we collected and put them in something called the State Education Fund. It said for 10 years it required that per pupil funding grow at least by the rate of inflation plus 1%. So if inflation was 2%, funding for schools had to grow by 3% as a way to catch up from the hole that we had dug in those prior years. And then it required after that for part of school funding to grow by at least the rate of the consumer price index. It also allowed the state it said the state was supposed to keep up with the funding from the general fund for schools except in years when we were in recessions, and then it could dip into this state education fund. Amendment 23, quote unquote, protected K-12 per pupil funding for the first 7 years of the 10 years that it was designed, that it was in place. What that did, because we had a recession in the middle of those years, is as we grew in appropriations for schools, we had to cut the money that was available for everything else. That's that exercise that y'all went through this morning, right? When you got one slice of the pie growing, has to come from someplace else. We had a shrinking pie. We had a growing of the portion of the pie that went to K-12 education, and we saw reductions in funding for other things. That's a primary explanation of why that slide that Chris showed about how it used to be that tuition paid for about 2/3, or that the state paid for about 2/3 of the cost of a college education, with tuition paying 1/3, and how that had flipped on its head. This is one of the big reasons. It's because we said a portion of that pie had to grow. Okay, Amendment 23. Referendum C. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Or maybe I'm not. No, I got my slides screwed up here. Let me go, keep going. Okay, there we are. 2005, Referendum C was on the ballot. You'll notice a trend. State was picking up yet even a bigger share of state funding for K-12 education. The other part of the trend is our per pupil funding was falling even more. We were now $1,000 below the national average. The assessment rate had dropped to 7.9%, or 7.96%. Broncos were still winning. 13-3 under Mike Shanahan. The recession in the early part of the century, plus those Amendment 23 requirements that I talked about, had forced a really significant reduction in the amount of money that was available to fund everything else in the budget. As I said, we'd seen some progress in funding schools, but it had come at the expense of funding everything else that the general fund is responsible for. At the time, the way the original provision in Tabor worked is it said that you applied inflation plus population to the prior year's tax collections. Got that? You apply the formula, the growth formula, to the prior year's collection. When you're in a recession, we talked about, revenues go down. Chris talked about a 13% reduction. What Tabor said as it was written is that when you dropped into a recession, you started over and you could only grow by inflation and population from that point on. We called that the ratchet effect. Okay? Referendum C, which was adopted by voters in 2005, like I said, made that 10-year timeout from ever having to give the money back. It said the state could keep and use all the money it collected for 10 years. I want to go to another slide first before we go to this one. Okay? So that timeout period, the Ref C timeout period, we gave us, those were the years in which any money collected above the green line, the state got to keep it. Rep C said, we're going to start calculating that formula from the highest year of revenue. And so instead of ratcheting down and starting to apply that inflation plus population to what we collected the prior year, it said we're going to apply inflation plus population to the formula. In other words, we're going to allow for growth of inflation plus population every year in revenue and build beyond that. And the effect of that is the red line, which means we've only had 1 year where we've given back Tabor rebates, compared to the green line. Had the original calculation been in place, we would have had Tabor rebates in all of the years where the blue bars exceed the green line. It's about $25 billion in state revenue that's been retained and used for education, healthcare, and transportation as a result of referendum C. In other words, that's the money that would have had to have been given back, and if you add all of the years that we didn't have to give it back, if you added them up together, it's about $25 billion. Now, how does all this affect you? You have low taxes. Our state and local taxes our state taxes rank 45th in the country as a percentage of our income. You also probably pay a higher percentage of your income in taxes than the wealthiest folks do because of that the requirement that we have a single rate income tax. We have fewer services, whether it's transportation or education. And it, quite frankly, makes it much more difficult, gives a lot fewer options to our elected officials to address the impact of growth going forward. And you all get the fun responsibility, all of us collectively, to decide what we do next. That's all I have prepared. I don't even have any idea what time is it. What time is it?
It's time.
Gosh darn. Are there any questions, comments? That's like the first time in my life I've ever finished on time. Yes?
Is there any solution?
Say that.
I mean, it's a terrible situation. I mean,
What is the solution?
you're never going to get them to vote.
Yeah, well, that's,
So what is the solution? That's something that I think all of us get to collectively work on. I think there's going to be a lot of options. I think our panel in a few minutes is going to be talking about one step, which is Proposition CC. It's going to be on the ballot. It starts to unwind some of these things. I have my own ideas about what the solutions are, but that's not for me to decide. I just run a small nonprofit in the state of Colorado. I think the state would be, my personal opinion, and the position of my organization, not the position of the senior lobby, is that we ought to return the tax policy making to the way every other state in the country does it and hold our elected officials accountable for making those decisions. But some people would see that as going in the wrong direction, and I understand that, John, so that's my solution. But I don't know, we'll see. Yes?
What is the difference in the consumer price index and the consumer confidence index?
It's a great question. The consumer price index literally is a measure of what it costs to buy today a set of things compared to what it used to cost, what it cost last year. So it's an inflation measure. The consumer confidence measure is a poll that asks people how are you feeling about your how are you feeling about the economy, how are you feeling about your own job prospects, how are you feeling about your own prospects of being able to pay off debt, et cetera, et cetera. So they're two very different measures. Any other questions? Yes? The question is, CFI is a nonprofit, how do we obtain our funding? Well, we are like every other charity or nonprofit in America. We get our money from funders. So we get money from foundations. The Colorado Health Foundation gives us money, the Colorado Trust gives us money, the Peton Foundation gives us money, the Denver Foundation gives us money. We get money from national funders as well. Right now we don't have a big national pool. Most of the money's coming locally. And we also get money from individual donors. So if anyone wants to write a check to the organization to support the great work that we do, I'd be more than happy to take it. And you know what's really weird? You can subtract that from your income taxes, maybe, depending upon what tax bracket you fall in, because the federal tax rules have changed that a little bit. Anybody else? Yes.
What would the difference be if we use the government price index, consumer price index, and the population?
So the question is, what would it be if we use the government price index versus a consumer price index? Well, I'm not sure there is something called a government price index. There are other measures, however. So there is a measure that measures the cost of education, right? It's an education cost measure. You go back to that slide. That would have meant that we would have been able to keep money, a lot more of it. Oh, there it is. That would be that one, that education piece. The ones that you hear talked about a lot and the legislature's considered a couple of times is to limit growth in government based upon growth in personal income. Total personal income is a different calculator or measurement of the economy. And it says how much is, like if you just took all of us together and figured out how much income we had and grew and compared that from one year to the next, that would be another measure. The way it would be different is it's just a little different. Some years it's below the consumer price index, some years it's above the consumer price index. If you look over the long term, it grows faster than the consumer price index. So depending upon when you started that would either mean there were more refunds or less refunds. The other measure I've heard talked about a lot is the state gross product, which is the measurement of how many things we produce. It tends to grow faster than CPI because it's a measurement of government activity, which includes profit or productivity in it, which is not included in the consumer price index, so it tends to, over time, grow more quickly. Anybody else? Yes?
Carol, with all the proposals out there to change Tabor, do they keep the balanced budget every year?
Yeah, the balanced budget, the requirement that the state balance its budget is in another part of the Constitution, kind of like the voter approval stuff, like the initiative. So the balanced budget requirement is contained in another section. I can't give you the section number, but it's in a different part of the budget. Yes?
Did the federal government change the way they calculate CPI and they call that the change CPI? So that's exacerbating the problem because it's not growing as fast as it would have.
That's a great question. The question was, hasn't the federal government changed the calculation of CPI? And it has been adapted over time. They have not gone to the changed CPI yet. That's a proposal that kicks around all the time. The thing about inflation that I find interesting is that we have an entire unit of federal government that's designed to keep it intentionally low. I mean, that's what the Fed is doing all the time, right? As they use monetary policy to adjust what inflation is or what interest rates are, that's really designed to make sure that inflation doesn't go up too quickly. So there's definitely an attempt by the federal government to keep that number low because it's hard. Inflation's a tough thing to have to deal with. Yes?
Well, what do they use PPI?
What's PPI?
Purchasers Price Index of business.
I don't
How much
know.
does it cost to buy it, which is what the state of Colorado used to do?
I don't know why they don't use PPI. I'm not familiar with that proposal. Anybody else? One more question up here, Bob. I see. I know. I got to hurry up. Yes.
To what extent has the change in taxes affected our income, state's income?
Well, so one thing I failed to mention, because it wasn't directly related to constitutional policy, although some people argue that it is directly related. In 1992, when the Tabor Amendment was adopted, the state's single rate income tax was 5%. In 1999 and then again in 2000, the legislature lowered the rate to the current 4.63%. Also lowered the state sales tax rate from 3% to 2.9%. That happened in, I don't know, 99 or 2000, I'm not sure, one of those 2 years. It's meant that the state collects less per taxpayer. right? Now, the amount of money collected has gone up because Elizabeth talked about growth, right? There was growth in the number of folks that have moved, that live here. There's also been growth in income in general. Primarily, that growth in income has been limited to the upper end tax brackets. I mean, there's a lot of us in the middle income categories haven't even seen our salaries get back to where they would be if they'd grown by inflation since the recession. But it's lowered the amount of money that comes in. I mean, Tabor's done a really good job of reducing the amount of money available to spend on public services. And some people think that's a great idea, right? And that it's been fairly effective. It has accomplished that much of its objective. Bob's just just dying to jump up. And we have a really fascinating panel that's coming up. And I really can't wait to hear this discussion, and I appreciate your attentiveness. And I only had to make you get up and giggle once. Thanks so much.